Welcome back to Jewish World Weekly on I-24 News. I'm Kalev Ben-David. Each week, we focus on stories, issues, and personalities of Jewish interest here in Israel and in the diaspora, the global Jewish community. And we start with our top 5 items in the Jewish world, presented by Bianca Zanini. Bianca?
Thanks, Kalev. Here are your top 5 items in the Jewish world this week. On October 27th, U.S. President Joe Biden marked 6 years since the shooting at Pittsburgh's Tree of Life synagogue that killed 11 worshipers and shook the community. Biden noted the, quote, appalling surge of Jew hatred since the October 7th attack in Israel and urged Americans to come together to ensure anti-Semitism and hate in all its forms have no safe harbor in America. Officials from the Jewish Agency and Rabbi Zamir Isayev, spiritual leader of Azerbaijan's Sephardic Jewish community, condemned comments in the Israeli media after 7 Israelis of Azeri origin were charged with spying for Iran, saying that insinuations that immigrants from the former Soviet republics may be more easily recruited as espionage agents cast false aspersions on the 80,000 Israelis with Azeri roots. Shelf Awareness, a leading trade publication for booksellers and libraries, cancels advertisements for the French Jewish philosopher Bernard-Henri Lévy's new book, Israel Alone, saying it could cause trouble for bookstores because the pro-Israel tone would spur complaints from employees and customers. Researchers in the UK say they have discovered the location of the first Jewish cemetery in England, which dates back nearly 1,000 years and was abandoned when Jews were expelled from the country in 1290. The remains of the burial ground were found beneath London's Barbican Estates, and the site suffered damage when the area was bombed by the Germans during World War II. Musician Phil Lesh, bassist of the legendary rock band The Grateful Dead, who also spent a decade hosting a musical Passover Seder in San Francisco as a tribute to the many Jewish deadheads, the group's most ardent fans, dies at 84, ending his long, strange trip. May his memory be a blessing. Back to you, Kalev.
It's the home stretch of the 2024 U.S. presidential campaign as voters ready to cast their ballots on November 5th for either Democratic Vice President Kamala Harris or former Republican President Donald Trump. Polls show this could be the tightest race in American history, and with unprecedented focus on the Jewish vote, which could prove decisive in such key swing states as Pennsylvania and Arizona. Israel's war in Gaza and the concurrent surge in anti-Semitism have become key issues. And while most polls show Democrats enjoying their traditional advantage in attracting Jewish votes, the GOP is convinced they can make inroads into that lead. So American Jewish voters have a choice to make. And to help them make the choice, let's hear from Haley Sofer. She's the CEO of the Jewish Democratic Council in Washington. And joining us from New York, Peter Deutsch. He's a former U.S. representative for the Democrats from the state of Florida. He's now switched over to supporting Donald Trump, and he's speaking to us from New York. And Haley, we're going to start with you. Democrats traditionally have drawn greater Jewish support. Should that continue in this election, and why?
Well, it should and it will. I have no doubt that 7 out of 10 Jewish voters will continue to support Democrats as they have for decades, specifically Kamala Harris, because we've never had a more stark contrast between 2 presidential candidates when it comes to issues of importance to the Jewish community. The number one issue driving Jewish voters in this election is the defense of our democracy. And while Kamala Harris is is a staunch defender of democracy. Donald Trump has said he wants to be a dictator on day one. And we saw last night at Madison Square Garden a very clear demonstration of his vitriol and the misogyny and the xenophobia and the kind of values that frankly are just antithetical to Jewish values, including the defense of our democracy. When it comes to anti-Semitism, Kamala Harris has been a strong partner and ally looking for ways to secure the Jewish community, including the unprecedented White House strategy to combat anti-Semitism that was put forward by this White House, while Donald Trump himself has aligned with anti-Semites. He has denigrated millions of American Jews on the campaign trail, repeatedly telling us we need to have our heads examined. He scapegoated the Jewish people as being partly responsible if he loses this election, which is definitionally anti-Semitic. And he has emboldened dangerous right-wing extremists. We saw when he was implored to condemn white supremacy in 2020, he refused and instead told the Proud Boys to stand back and stand by, and they heeded his call on January 6th. And finally, when it comes to Israel, Kamala Harris has been a staunch partner and ally of the U.S.-Israel relationship. I saw this firsthand. I served as her national security advisor in the Senate, traveled to Israel with her in 2017. She understands the distinct security threats that Israel faces from Iran and its proxies, Hezbollah and Hamas. She has repeatedly provided assurances that she would ensure Israel has what it needs to defend itself, and she's backed those assurances.
Is this a filibuster from the time she opened her mouth? First of all, I would bet her, I'd mortgage my house, that the numbers she's saying in terms of voters is not going to be accurate. I'm happy to do that. I'm saying it publicly. I'm happy to do that. But let's just talk about the last thing she talked about, which should really be the first thing that she talks about. I mean, Kamala Harris, from everything, from the time she was a U.S. Senator, when she criticized the president from eliminating General Soleimani, to the time that she's taken office, but particularly since October 7th, every time she has opened her mouth, there's been a real question, whose side is she on? The most important issue in terms of deciding who to vote for president is going to be how the president to achieve and maintain peace in the world. And look at the reality of what happened. 4 years of Donald Trump as president, we had peace, we had prosperity, we had no wars. 4 years under the Harris-Biden administration, we've had wars, we've had destruction, we've had death. The complete difference, if there's a complete difference, there's a complete difference in terms of how the two candidates deal with Iran. I mean, President Trump, basically the first day he came into office, stopped funding for Iran. Basically, they were bankrupt at the end of 4 years. They basically had no money. They couldn't fund Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. The Harris-Biden administration, the first day they came into office, they basically started funding Iran. They've effectively given them over $100 billion, which literally they have used to fund Hamas, the Houthis, and Hezbollah. This is not a complicated issue. Basically, there's one candidate in this race who is literally giving money to someone who wants to kill your family. For everyone who's listening in Israel, this is a candidate who wants to give someone money to kill every Jew, every person in the state of Israel. And there's another candidate for 4 years who protected not just Israel, but the world in terms of his commitment to using force when it was necessary. This is, any Jew that votes for Kamala Harris is out of their mind. And again, if they, there's a reason for this, and it's as clear as night and day. And I can talk about the other issues. They've been debunked continuously in terms of anti-Semitism. Kamala Harris, when she was sworn into office, had an anti-Semite pastor give these prayer at the inauguration. She's met with anti-Semites on multiple occasions. Just debunk BS, and she can say it, but it's just not true.
Okay, I have given you both equal amount of time for an opening statement. Now I'll ask you to stay to 60 seconds, and I will give you Haley a chance to respond.
I'm happy to respond, but I'm not going to do this if he's going to interrupt me. So, Peter, can we agree that we're not going to interrupt each other?
60 seconds, 60 seconds. Enjoy.
Caleb is actually timing this. So is there a question?
Yes, I first of all, you can respond to that, and specifically, for example, on the issue of the handling of Iran and its proxies, which I think was the key point Peter made.
When it comes to Israel, Kamala Harris has been a staunch partner and ally, and this White House in the past year has given exponentially more funding, not to terrorists, Peter, but to Israel. $17.8 billion provided in the past year to support Israel's security and right to self-defense. They have twice deployed the U.S. military, including moving carrier strike groups to the Eastern Mediterranean twice to ensure that Israel is defended against these unprecedented Iranian attacks. They did not provide Iran with the funding you are talking about. This had to do with something that occurred before October 7th, which was a prisoner swap, a political prisoner swap, where some money was unfrozen and never used solely for humanitarian purposes. So it's important. You may be entitled to your opinions, but let's stick with the facts.
All right, that is 60 seconds. Peter, go ahead. Peter, go ahead.
You can spin it any way you want. By not enforcing sanctions, Iran has literally got at least $100 billion. Okay, and that's because of decision effectively almost from day one of the Biden administration. Iran was basically bankrupt by the time Donald Trump left office. I really wonder sometimes which side that Kamala Harris and Joe Biden are on, whether they're on the side of Iran or whether they're on the side of America. Every time Kamala Harris has opened her mouth since October 7th, she has said something about Israel shouldn't do this. Israel shouldn't do this. Israel shouldn't do this. She's proud. I've seen her on TV being proud of restricting weapons to Israel to fight for its survival. I mean, literally almost every day, Israel is fighting for its survival. And again, when she talks about how do you think there's statements in terms of Sinwar and even now that have come out that the comments of the Biden-Harris administration effectively have encouraged him.
All right, Peter, that is 60 seconds. Now I do want to ask a question. So I want to just ask Haley, what will be, if you could as briefly say, the policy of Kamala Harris towards Israel specifically on its prosecution of the war, for example, against Hamas and Hezbollah going forward?
This is no mystery. Kamala Harris has repeatedly provided assurances that she will ensure that Israel has what it needs to defend itself following the horrific attacks of October 7th. Kamala Harris has been unequivocal in her condemnation of terror, and she has stood with Israel as it faces ongoing security threats from Hezbollah, Hamas, and Iran. She has provided repeat assurances that she will continue to ensure that Israel has what it needs to defend itself, and she's backed those assurances up with action, including providing unprecedented amounts of military aid to Israel. Perhaps just as importantly as well, she has provided assurances that she stands with the Jewish community as we face a scourge of anti-Semitism. Donald Trump himself has emboldened anti-Semites. He's engaged and trafficked in anti-Semitic rhetoric, and the vitriol and hatred that he's demonstrated on the campaign trail is a direct threat to Jewish Americans and to our values. Okay. So I have no doubt Jews will continue to support Democrats in this election.
Peter, I would like you to respond to that final point, because you actually didn't get the chance to respond. That final point
every
about
time she opens her mouth, all she talks about is Palestinians. Okay, and again, obviously, it's tragic when innocent Palestinians die. But all of us on this show, and everyone in Israel, and anyone in the world who wants to think, understands that the only reason innocent Palestinians have died is because Hamas has basically embedded themselves with innocent Palestinians. And again, every time she opens her mouth, that's what she's talking about. She is proud of the fact that America withheld weapons and was slow-walking weapons for Israel's existential survival. I mean, when people talk about in front of her the false claims of genocide. She's nodding her head at the end of the conversation.
Peter, I would like you to respond to her charge of Donald Trump emboldening anti-Semitism. You had started to give an answer to that.
Every instance has been debunked. As I said previously, she has associated with as many anti-Semites as he has, because sometimes in their job, the person that did the prayer at the inauguration of her when she was first inaugurated is an anti-Semite. She's met with the students at schools run by Hamas. She, spoke in organizations where there are anti-Semites there. I mean, the only one who's really done anything about anti-Semitism in terms of the two candidates is President Trump in terms of dealing with anti-Semitism on college campuses, where he, by executive order, put an executive order that really has protected the only protection students have had. We have anti-Semitism every day in America now on college campuses, and specifically, Kamala Harris has done nothing since October 7th about this rampant, insane anti-Semitism in America.
All right, we're going to have to leave it at that. Listen, this has been a difficult campaign. This was a difficult discussion, maybe emblematic of that. And I can tell you that certainly from the perspective of Israel, what one most hope is that whatever happens on November 5th, the United States will emerge in some degree united and strong, because that is good for Israel and that is good for the rest of the world itself. I'd like to thank Kaylee Sofer and Peter Deutsch for joining us this week on Jewish World Weekly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, while Republicans and Democrats may debate which candidate is really the most supportive of Israel, the most overtly anti-Israel candidate in the U.S. presidential race happens to be Jewish. That's Jill Stein of the far-left Green Party, who is channeling widespread anger among Arab Americans and Muslims over U.S. support for Israel's actions in Gaza and Lebanon, turning her into a surprising voice for pro-Palestinian voters in battleground states that could make or break Kamala Harris's campaign. Our Yulia Pobogalova has that story.
Widespread anger among Arab Americans and Muslims over U.S. support for Israel's actions in Gaza and Lebanon could cost Kamala Harris the election. This, according to Green Party candidate Jill Stein, who, while being Jewish, is gaining increasing support for her strong anti-Israel stance.
We will free Palestine. Palestine will free us.
Although polls show Stein with just 1% of the upcoming November 5th election, she has seen growing endorsements among Arab Americans and Muslims in battleground states like Michigan, Arizona, and Wisconsin, where these communities help propel President Joe Biden to victory.
This is a very dire situation that will be continued under both Democrats and Republicans. So we say there is no lesser evil in this race.
A physician and longtime activist, Stein was raised in Illinois in a Reform Jewish household, attending Chicago's North Shore Congregation Israel. Now she's campaigning for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza, an immediate U.S. arms embargo on Israel.
We refuse to be talked into selling our souls, into compromising, into being talked, into affirming, endorsing, and enabling genocide.
Stein's unique position as a Jewish voice critical of Israel resonates with pro-Palestinian protesters and groups like Abandon Harris, who aim to challenge the Democratic Party's stance on the Israel-Palestine conflict.
We may not be in a large number to put somebody in the office, but we will definitely be, we are definitely in the numbers to take somebody out of the office.
And with people personally affected by the conflict in the Middle East.
They need to know, okay, that you're not going to get the Arab and Muslim vote if you're not going to help us, okay? It's not unconditional.
Approximately 3.5 million Americans identify as being of Middle Eastern descent in the 2020 U.S. Census, the first year such data was recorded. Although they make up about 1% of the total U.S. population, their votes may prove crucial in a race that polls show to be close.
Let's go now to our senior U.S. correspondent, Mike Wagenheim in Washington, D.C. And Mike, as we come into the last days of this race, how do you assess how both of the campaigns, the Trump and Harris campaigns, have done in their outreach to American Jewish voters?
Poorly, honestly, Kalev. There were a number of arguments to make on both sides of the equation in terms of the Israel bona fides, in terms of protecting the Jewish community. I don't think either side really did a very good job of pronouncing, those bright spots within their particular administrations. Really, it was more of an attack on the other side, and I don't think those attacks at this point really hit their marks or resonated with voters. But you got to look at what's been going on over the last few election cycles. Republicans have managed to chip into that Democratic Jewish vote a percentage point, 2 percentage points over multiple cycles now. It starts to add up. This one is, of course, much different. Why? Well, because you have Trump, who's already, has his reputation established one way or another, but also because of the war right now and the effect that it's had politically over the last year and the anti-Semitism rise in the U.S., which it's had, which makes some voters feel unsafe. Maybe they'll go with a candidate that they otherwise wouldn't go with because of the current situation. And so I think it will have an impact, but you got to look at where it will have an impact. On the presidential race, Pennsylvania and Arizona, both swing states, battleground states that will be contested to the last vote, essentially. Both of those states have populations, Jewish populations, with over 2%. They could be incredibly critical. Biden won those states by less than 2% 4 years ago. And you look as well at who controls Congress. This is going to be a tight race in the House as well. You look at the situation in New York, in the suburbs. Those are the seats that really won Republicans the House in the last midterm election cycle, heavily on a Jewish vote that at the time switched because of issues like crime, economy, issues that are everyday issues, but they saw it in a different way there. Can Democrats flip those seats back now and regain control of the House? I think those are the areas you really need to look for. Pennsylvania, Arizona, the New York suburbs as well. Those are the areas that are really going to have an impact come Election Day and, honestly, in the days that follow until the count is finally tallied up.
All right, Mike, and of course we'll be looking at those crucial areas, states, districts, and those crucial races in Congress when the time comes, and of course assess the results after. Mike Wagenheim, thanks for being with us on Jewish World Weekly. A few weeks ago, a group of Spanish scientists made a claim that generated global headlines, saying that DNA research taken from the remains of Christopher Columbus and his son and a brother from their presumed tomb in the Seville Cathedral confirmed long-standing theories that the famed explorer had Sephardic Jewish roots, origins he concealed to avoid persecution. But since that dramatic announcement, others have cast doubts on the results and methodology of this years-long study, and some have gone further in asserting that Columbus, whose date of discovery of the Americas has been celebrated as a holiday of pride for Italian Americans, is not and never was Jewish. Well, one of them is David Perry, historian at the University of Minnesota, whose latest book is Oathbreakers, The War of Brothers That Shattered an Empire and Made Medieval Europe. And he joins us now from Minneapolis. And thank you so much for joining us, David. First, before we get into the study and your conclusions, let me just ask you, even when I was growing up, I heard these stories that Columbus may have been Jewish. Where does that even come from, the belief that he might have been Jewish?
Yeah, there was a 1934 article, is the oldest thing that I can find, Jewish Telegraph Agency, that talked about it and pointed to some 19th century research that converted Jews were part of his funding backers. And that's really the evidence. That is the whole evidence. It is true that many Jews had to conceal their origins in the period. That's true history. We don't know a lot about Columbus's origins, so the speculation was, well, maybe he was Jewish. If that sounds like not a lot of good evidence, that's correct. That is the whole evidence.
Also, the coincidence of 1492 and dealing with the expulsion of Spain, I think people have kind of tried to link that. Well, let's talk about this. Okay, so not a lot of evidence there. What about this Spanish study, which is making the claim that they've studied DNA taken from his remains and some members of his family, and says that there was a high probability of Sephardic Jewish roots?
Yeah, so I was excited when I saw that headline too, and then I started reading. There is no published study. And what we have is someone on television, on a documentary, saying, I have completed a study. That's really, again, all the evidence. Now, maybe in a month or 2 months or 10 years, a published study that has gone through, peer review that tells us what actual genetic tests were done will come out. And then I'll have to come back on the air and say, oh, I was wrong. But I don't think I am. And in part, it's because there is no particular kind of study that you can then point to and say, oh, that's a Sephardic gene. That person must have been Sephardic. What we can say is that if they have Columbus's DNA, which we don't know, that he came from the Western Mediterranean, which was a place of a lot of movement of peoples. And so it's not ruled out that he could be Sephardic, but that's a big difference between saying that he is.
So what, as I mentioned, Italian Americans like to claim Columbus as their own. What is your best theory of exactly who Columbus was, who has a connection with Spain and, of course, with Italy and Genoa?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the evidence that he's from Genoa is as good as any evidence. I don't think his origins, where he was born, is significant unless we find in his writings, and we have a lot of his writings, that somehow where he came from shaped what he did or what he thought or what he said. And to the extent that he is, again, a Western Mediterranean Catholic invested in Western Mediterranean Catholic things, like thinking about the Crusades and these nations and then exploring and conquest and gold, that's what matters, is what he did and what his motivations were. And wherever he was born, and again, I think it was Genoa. I'm comfortable saying it was Genoa. But wherever he was born, that's not, as a historian, I think, particularly significant.
All right. Well, so Columbus Day will not become a Jewish holiday, it sounds like, in the near future.
Think so, no.
Italian Americans
I don't think so.
Can relax a bit. David Perry, thank you so much for joining us on Jewish World Weekly.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us this week on Jewish World Weekly.